right. So I'm a researcher of deliberative theory and practice with a specific focus on children and young people. And after my PhD, I started a new project that is an ethnographic study with youth climate activists in Japan, in Kyoto, where I used to work. And in the past 2.5 years, I have been working with youth climate activists in a very close way, like rather than observing activists in a third person or neutral way, I try to immerse myself into the field. I try to be part of the phenomenon. I joined with their varieties of activity, like protesting activity and organized marching and joint meeting and engage in decision makings. And then, sometimes I did interviews and, collecting these data, and I took batches of field notes. And then taken together, I try to understand the experience of young people's participation in youth climate activism and how they, for example, deliberate within the meeting, how they make a decision, how they organize to give shape of the climate activism. And then Fridays for Future Kyoto is one of the biggest local groups of Fridays for Future movement in the context of Japan. And then I'm currently at the stage of sorting out all data which I collected, and then did a first coding by using the NVivo. But there are many stories that I would like to present here, but it requires more than 10 hours, so I need to focus on a specific story. So especially in general, many scholarly research on the recent Fridays for Future movement tended to focus on more kind of the positive stories, like, look, young people are historically oppressed, but now young people appear in the public sphere and go on the street, engage in the varieties of protesting activities, so they design varieties of unique participatory practices. This is very good. This is what young people's political agency looks like. But my research finds that such an overemphasis or sometimes over-romanticization of the experience of youth climate activism sometimes runs the risk of neglecting the key challenges or injustice, or I'd say injustices they confront while doing protest. So today's my presentation will more focus on kind of the negative experience of youth climate activism rather than the positive one. So let me first start by the 3 photos. So when I started my field work, it's a summary of 2021 to 2022 anyway. When I started my field work with climate activists, there are many young people, including junior high to university students, who are very fully motivated. And then there are many participants on the street doing the protest. But a few months later, the number of participants has been dropping. And then a year later, I sometimes witnessed 0 participant of the street. And then I was wondering why this happened. And of course, there are many types of explanatory framework, but my question, broader question is like young people are initially fully motivated to resist climate injustice and call for climate justice, but some members suddenly drop their motivation or stop their resistance. And why? Of course, the very general explanation is like a COVID-19, young people are very afraid of being infected, so that's why they decide not to participate in activism. This is, of course, one, possible explanation. But when working closely with youth climate activists, I also found another explanatory framework, which I called compounding injustice. And this is a kind of type of sequential experience of injustice where youth climate activists engage in a specific political activity, but in the middle of the practice, they receive bunches of different types of injustices, and then they become fatigued and they become very burned out, then they stop doing the protest. So I will explain, this idea of compounding injustice is totally under theorization, so I need your comment, suggestion, and a bit of criticism, and then hopefully I can establish this idea in a more sophisticated way. So the compounding injustice, when the idea comes to my mind first, I Googled it to check whether there is a similar or same concept, but I didn't find this concept, but instead I found similar ideas that are multiple or double injustice. So it focused on one's simultaneous experience of injustice, like when people in a poor country experience a serious flood caused as a result of the climate change, we might say that people suffer from both global poverty and climate change. So it's a kind of one, simultaneous experience of injustice, and this is sometimes very important. It serves as a very important framework for explaining how, vulnerable people becomes more disempowered as a result of their simultaneous experience of injustice. But it focuses too much on the people's passive and powerless aspect, like people in poor countries suffer from varieties of injustices and they become more disempowered, but it sometimes overlooks how they try to exert their political agency to resist the injustice they confront. So John used to wrote an article, Democratic Agency of Justice. Is it the correct title? Yeah, and then he focused on, in the article, he focused on the political agency or democratic agency of the poor people. So the poor people tended to be regarded as the least advantaged people who are very passively waiting for the material redistribution. But John says that it is not always the case. Under the right condition, even the poor people exert their political agency to redefine the issue in question or challenge the key structural problems. So so we do not need to treat vulnerable people or marginalized people as just passive or powerless people. And sometimes people exert their agency to resist political injustices. And young people as well. Young people are not just the passive victims of the climate change. So, as I will show you later, they stand up and appear on the street and engage in the resistive activities. So in this sense, if we use multiple or double injustice, it might run the risk of neglecting the kind of political agencies that young people exert. So therefore, instead, I coined the term confronting injustice that focused more on the sequential rather than the simultaneous experience of injustice. So I think it allows us to understand how people exert their political agency to resist the specific injustice and nonetheless become disempowered due to another type of injustice, which is epistemic oppressions. So on the basis of my field data, I identified 5 key elements that consist of compounding injustice. It begins by the primary injustice. It's a kind of target injustice. And then in order to protest against such primary injustice, people engage in a specific form of resistance, which is epistemic resistance, and that suffer from the epistemic oppressions that followed by protection for resistance and further burdens. So let me explain these elements one by one in more detail. So let's begin by the primary injustice. So, I think I don't need to explain it too much because there are many people who are very familiar with environmental politics and young people's issues. But for young people, climate change is a kind of injustice in 2 senses. On the one hand, young people think that they are the victims of climate change as a result of the past generations' irresponsible use of material resources, and that deprives them of the environment and opportunities that they would have enjoyed. But at the same time, they are very afraid of being victimizers because if they take no action right now, probably they might inevitably commit climate injustice. And then from the perspective of the future generations, they might think that the present generation, including young people, do nothing for us, and then they are the victimizers. So, these are the discussion about intergenerational injustice, but at least young people are very afraid of being victims and also the victimizers who commit the climate change or climate crisis. So in order to get out from this dilemma, they engage in the specific form of resistance. Of course, there are varieties of options of resistance, including violent to non-violent, or disruptive or non-disruptive one. But generally speaking, young people, youth climate activists in general, tended to learn a lot of lessons, historic lessons about the problem of doing the disruptive and violent action. Like, if they commit violent action or disruptive action, it might run the risk of losing the public support and sympathy, which they do not want to do. So, like, if you check the web page of the Australian version of the climate change movement, like, school strike for climate, they say on the top page, they say we are the non-violent climate activists, and we do not engage in any such violent or disruptive activity. We are very peaceful climate change movement. So they often bring the non-violentness to the forefront of their movement. And especially, of course, there are varieties of non-violent protest, but among them, they sometimes engage in what is called epistemic resistance, because this is easy and quick and sometimes very cheap, but still it sometimes gives a very tangible effect. So the core idea of epistemic resistance is that it uses knowledge as a means for resistance. But knowledge, it does not always mean that scientifically evidenced expert knowledge. So knowledge here means knowledge in epistemic resistance here means that using stories or more grassroots experiences or first-person perspectives with respect to the issue in question, and then using such knowledge as such stories and narratives and experience as a knowledge and testify it in the public sphere in order to call for more attention or gain more sympathy or reframe the issue in question. Like Greta Thunberg is a very nice example of the person who do many epistemic resistances. Like while doing school strikes, she shared varieties of her emotions and stories and experience in the schools, and then use such experience as knowledge and testify it in the public sphere, and then gain more attention from the public, and or the people in broader publics can learn about climate change from multiple angles. So with regard to the Fridays for Future Kyoto, which I observed, they also engage in various epistemic inputs, make epistemic inputs in the public discourse making. Like when they have a chance to discuss with mayor of Kyoto City, they share their varieties of experiences as youth. Like I am a high school student in Kyoto City, and I experienced climate change like that. I'm worrying about climate change because as young people, I'm worrying about this and that. Then rather than showing scientific knowledge, they share their experience in front of the decision maker and then try to persuade him. Or when they do the protest actions on the street, they brought various cardboard, t-shirts, writing many messages or essays. Then they show what young people think about climate change and walk around Kyoto City or stand on the protest, holding the placard, so that the spectator can learn about what young people think about climate change. And then, and such epistemic resistance is effective as long as they are recognized as a knower or a kind of a contributor of epistemic contributor of the public discourse making. But it's not always successful, because what is waiting next is epistemic oppressions. Like when they testify their experience as knowledge in the public sphere, they sometimes experience what Miranda Flicker calls testimonial injustice, which occurs when the prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to the speaker's words. So young people try to express something like their experience or their narratives, but that kind of speech is not recognized as an epistemic input or knowledge, because they are not trusted as knower in the first place. So it does not mean it is not a rejection of the testimony itself. Opportunities is given. Young people have opportunity to express their opinion in the public space, share their knowledge, but their capacity as a knower is not trusted because of the biases or prejudice that adults or people in power have. So even though young people make a best effort in sharing their sharing their experience, it is not regarded as knowledge in the first place. And such prejudice happens because that is sometimes anchored by the significant power imbalance between young people and adults in the public sphere, which is part of my PhD project. Generally speaking, adults tend to have an impression that young people are less mature, less capable, so less politically ineffective compared to adults. So, adults pretend to listen to young people, but in reality, their listening is very biased, and they do not trust young people as a capable knower in the first place. So let me give you one example of how youth climate activists in Japan experience such epistemic oppressions. So let me read the manuscript because this is a very important story. So in the middle of 2021, Fridays for Future Kyoto got an invitation from the Kyoto city to join its decarbonized lifestyle meeting, which is official decision-making meeting, as a committee member. So the meeting was kind of citizen-centric deliberative policy-making or policy recommendation committee where very famous and very popular public figures gather and discuss together, like including professors or CEOs, monks and architects, etc., etc. And youth climate activists in Kyoto felt very honored, very excited when they received invitation, because usually both young people and activists are not so frequently invited to such decision-making body. So the Miss M decided to participate in this meeting as a committee member and the representatives of the Fridays for Future Kyoto. So they prepared, and they took so much time to prepare for the meeting. Then the Miss M participated in it. But right after the meeting, she had quite little to say about her experience. And I observed her crushing disappointment after the first meeting. And 1 week later, she invited me to a member-only group meeting where she shared her experience in the meeting. And she said that, I don't know how to hide this. All right, let me read it. Hang on. All right, many adults define what Fridays for Future Kyoto is all about one-sidedly. At the event, there was always a play script written by adults. The adults wanted me to talk about a specific story, and I felt that they wanted me to tell a Greta-like story. So they expected me to get angry with politicians, as Greta did, that this is not my story. And after all, adults invited us to decorate their activity. So they were not interested in who we are, why we are there, and what we are doing. So, when Miss Anne tried to testify her experience, as a youth in Kyoto City and her, how she perceived climate change in Kyoto City, many adults or people in power tend to focus not on her story per se, but on the identities that she has, like a young female and activist. So many adults tend to see her as if she is a copy of Greta Thunberg, and that they listen her experience in the more within a given framework of the Greta Thunberg. So if she says something, they say, "Oh, your story is very much like Greta Thunberg, and it's very you are Japanese Greta Thunberg," and something like that. Or she participated in this meeting because she wanted to collaborate with adults or decision makers, but many adults expected her to get angry with adults or politicians, but she didn't want to do so, but many adults expected to do so. In the middle of the meeting, she thought that she needed to accept such expectation from adults. Otherwise, she felt that her voice was not taken seriously by adults. So that's why she said that there is always a play script written by adults, and she felt that she was invited not to testify her experience, but just decorate their adults' activities. So when people, experience such epistemic oppressions, they needed to think about a strategy for protecting themselves from the epistemic oppression. But their primary purpose is to deal with the primary injustice rather than secondary injustice. So they need to think about a strategy for not only for guarding themselves from the epistemic oppression, but also for continuing to engage in the, to the way of addressing the primary justice. So then they often choose what I call protection for resistance. That is an attempt for guarding oneself from epistemic oppression in order to continue to deal with target injustice. So I especially observed the two different types of protection for resistance. One is non-participation, another one is non-collaboration. So non-participation here is, after a couple of meetings, and then they experience bunches of epistemic oppression, so they decide not to participate in the meeting any longer because they know that when participating in the meeting in the Kyoto city, they know that they suffer from epistemic oppression, so they decide not to participate in the meeting and they try to find another way to address the climate change. Or non-collaboration. Yes, their meeting used to be very open for many people, and many people can be organizers of the Fridays for Future Kyoto, regardless of the age. But one day they suddenly set an age limit for the participant or organizer or those who can attend their in-group meeting, because they are afraid of the presence of adult when they do something in the public sphere. And one member says that if there are no age limitation, knowledgeable or powerful adult may join our group, and if such adult speaks in our meeting, he becomes so influential and dominates our meeting. So it creates an atmosphere of adults are always right, and this is not good. Our age limit is not so strict, but we think such restriction is important. So they protect themselves by intentionally excluding adults from their activities, or they intentionally stop collaborating with adults. So far, what young people experience is, they start by the climate change as primary injustice, then they start engaging in epistemic resistance, and then in the middle way, they experience epistemic oppressions as a secondary injustice. So then in order to deal with the epistemic oppression and continue their resistance against primary injustice, they decided to engage in protection for resistance. So what they expected is to engage more on the primary injustice rather than secondary injustice. But after choosing such protection for resistance, what is waiting next is further burdens. So after choosing the protection for resistance, they receive bunches of criticisms or public accusations. So one day, when we did a standing protest as usual on the street, one middle-aged man approached us and he started criticizing us with loud voice. You did a very meaningless activity, that you are not making enough effort. And he then asked us, have you ever tried to work with decision maker, or have you ever make any substantial influence over decision maker? But we couldn't answer this question because we chosen the non-participation and non-collaboration. So we decided to exit from the decision-making practice. So we couldn't answer that question, and we kept silent. And he continued criticisms. You didn't do any good job with politicians, or your activity is super meaningless. Or even that our collaborators sometimes say that, you should trust adults more and you should do more impactful activities. So, to this end, you needed to trust adults and work with adults more rather than doing just standing activities and so on. And the member feels very, frustrated by hearing such words, because one member says, many adults focus on the consequence. They don't see the process or what we are fighting against. So they say, Japanese youth climate activists are very optimistic compared to Fridays for Future in overseas, or Fridays for Future Japan's activity is always incomplete. But adults should know that we become less motivated because of their microaggressions. So the question here is why when they decide to engage in protection for resistance, why they receive such criticisms. So again, from the perspective of the people in power, they understand that young people confront primary injustice and engage in epistemic resistance. But the problem here is that the fact of epistemic oppression is often publicly invisible. Like, because epistemic oppression occurs on the basis of the prejudice that people have. So prejudice, we are sometimes quite unconscious about the prejudice and bias that we have. So even though some people think that they are doing the good things, like, we include young people in the decision making, and we collaborate with young people, but they are not so conscious about the fact of epistemic oppression, or they think that there is no injustice. And this is a core feature of epistemic oppression. This is usually the publicly invisible, according to Miller and Flicker. So what people in power usually observe is not the fact of epistemic oppression, but the fact of protection for resistance. So, but for them, the connection between epistemic resistance and protection for resistance is inconsistent, because for them, like, young people start doing protest, engaging in protesting activity, but they suddenly stop working with adults. They suddenly exit from the public sphere. So they do not understand why young people do so. So they start criticisms like, young people are less sincere or inconsistent. You should take their activity into account seriously. Then youth climate activists needed to deal with a lot of things here. Like, they needed to deal with primary injustice. They sometimes needed to deal with epistemic oppression, and they needed to think about strategy for protection, for resistance. And they also needed to cope with further criticism from the third person. So there are a lot of jobs that they have to do at the same time. Then they become very, feeling exhausted. They have no energy and time to resist, to engage meaningfully in the primary injustice, and then they become burnout. Then they think that it's a waste of time, waste of energy to deal with a lot of things at the same time. Then they stop working on the climate change or work as a youth climate activist. So the three pictures that I showed first initially says that, COVID-19 would be the one explanation, like, they are afraid of being infected. But the other story says that, youth climate activists stop appearing on the street because there are a lot of things that they have to do. Then they become less motivated and then stop doing protesting. So youth climate activists to fight against not only the climate change, but also the epistemic oppressions in the public sphere. And we sometimes encourage young people uncritically, and then, youth climate activists, they do a good job. But if we are very uncritical about our, the fact of the epistemic oppression or power imbalance between adults and young people in the public sphere, our uncritical encouragement might run the risk of enabling more tokenistic or epistemic oppression, oppressive participation. And then, the compounding injustice allows us to understand the detailed experience of youth climate activists. And it's a kind of the vicious cycle, but, there are very little research about the mechanism of vicious cycle, and probably the compounding injustice might help us to understand how such vicious cycles occur in the experience of the youth climate activism. All right, thank you very much for your attention.